The late 19th and early 20th century was a particularly fertile period for campaigning journalism. The increasing ease of communication, combined with the widespread unease about the excesses of colonialism and industrialization and labor conditions, gave rise to this sort of intellectual ferment and political activism, which created a new interest in advocacy and investigative journalism. The battles that make the headlines today against corruption or human trafficking or corporate exploitation, for women's rights and workers' rights, these are subjects that journalists have been writing about for more than 150 years. Campaigning journalism helped spread ideas like the evils of slavery or news about brutal working conditions and labor exploitation. People published pamphlets, newsletters, newspapers. Some is very personal, a bit like blogs today. In the US, the muckrakers wrote for McClure's magazine, which benefited from paid circulation. Not having one powerful advertiser, but getting small amounts of money from lots of readers was critical. This gave journalists freedom to write without pressure from a big advertiser who wanted to influence content. Overseas, some of the large media houses that we know today were just getting established. But despite this flowering of media outlets and newspapers, despite the spread of the railway and the telegraph, it was still really hard to get information. Many of the global muckraking journalists from 100 years ago spent a huge amount of time trying to verify facts. Like today, journalists then relied on information from primary documents, first-hand experience, witness interviews, and in some cases, information from advocates and campaigners. Sometimes the journalists explicitly crossed the lines into advocacy, again, as some do today. And this will be a subject that we return to during our course. Adam Hochschild, in his book Bury the Chains, describes how the abolitionist movement was a transnational movement that crossed borders. Abolitionists funded journalists to tell stories of the enslaved and the exploited. They hoped that these articles would generate public support and that this would spur governments to act. They learned that telling sad stories about real people was far more effective than just quoting the Bible. Some of the global muckrakers of the late 19th and early 20th century also wrote about trafficking and labor conditions. Some were not professional journalists to begin with, but they became journalists because they wanted to fight for justice. Others became famous for writing about a certain topic. Henry Wood Nevinson, for example, was known for his articles on slavery. Their campaigning succeeded. It took time, but eventually the slave trade was banned in many parts of the world. However, this was a period when the world was industrializing. Railways were being built, and people needed cheap workers. So around the world, millions of people crossed borders to build railways, pick crops, all under brutal conditions. Often what they were doing was moving from one part of the British Empire, like India, to another part. Just like today, workers were often recruited with promises of jobs that didn't exist, or they signed contracts that weren't worth the paper they were written on. Many times they thought they could go home after 5 years, but then they weren't allowed. So we think of trafficking as a modern problem, but in fact, indentured servitude, which is similar to slavery, was a huge problem in the 19th century. One of the people who was the first to write about it was the muckraker Dwarkanath Ganguly, who covered human trafficking in the late 1890s. He was from Calcutta, and he was born at a time when the British ruled India. At the young age of 17, he began publishing a magazine about women's rights. He was known as a social reformer and a campaigner for women's rights, and he became head of one of India's first girls' schools. We know a lot about Ganguly from the writing of historian Jata Sharma at the University of Toronto. Ganguly became interested in the problems of indentured servitude and the conditions of on the tea plantations in Assam, India. We know from Sharma's book that Ganguly traveled for days in secrecy to get to Assam to see the plantations for himself. He took a train from Calcutta, a steamboat, and then he made a long trek. When he got there, he found that the conditions were absolutely horrendous. He said hundreds of thousands of people had been defrauded, Sharma writes. The workers had been given misleading contracts and were paid far less than they had promised. They had to work long hours in exhausting conditions with poor housing and lack of sanitation, nor were they allowed to leave when they wanted to. What the workers experienced in the tea plantations of Assam was not very different from slavery, which had been officially outlawed. In 1887, Ganguly published a series of reports on what he had seen in the Calcutta newspapers, including the nationalist anti-colonial newspaper Sanjibani. Sharma tells us that these were the first such reports in British India about the colonial tea industry and its labor conditions. They caused an outcry, and they inspired journalists to do investigations in other parts of the world. Again, an example of how good reporting can spread ideas. This often happens after journalists report on a subject. Conditions didn't change straight away, but Ganguly's reports were widely read and helped spread awareness about what was really happening. Sharma tells us that this got the Indian nationalists interested in this problem of trafficking, or what it was called coolies, and the condition of these laborers became part of the platform of the independence movement of India. When we think about what makes journalism have an impact, it's worth noting something that Sharma writes about. Ganguly was a member of the Hindu Brahmo Samaj sect. This sect wanted to reform religion and culture by removing abusive practices that affected women and children, such as dowry and child marriage. Many members of this group were highly educated, they had progressive ideas, and they were members of the Indian National Congress, a political organization that was active in the fight against British colonialism. Part of why Ganguly's ideas resonated was because there was already a sympathetic group of people in larger social movements campaigning on the same problems that Ganguly wrote about. When we think about the times in history that reporting by global muckrakers has an impact, one thing that becomes clear is that their journalism resonates when there are others working on the same cause. Today, plantation workers are still underpaid and human trafficking still exists, but Ganguly's reporting convincingly documented how this global situation is connected to what happened on the British-owned tea plantations more than 100 years ago. Ganguly wrote about conditions in Assam, a place that was remote, but his writing reverberated, and as so often happens, it inspired more reporting and investigations. Sharma explains that Totaram Sandaya even published his own first-person account of his time as an indentured laborer on Fiji sugar plantations. Just like today, the world was globalized in the 19th century, and ideas could spread. Information was harder to verify, and news took longer to spread than it does now, but sometimes stories got global attention and could make a difference. Part of what we'll be looking at in this course is when and under what conditions journalism had an impact and changed the world.